The morning after the frost broke in March of 1871, Sheriff Elmer Thorne rode out to the Whitlow Ranch expecting silence. The kind of silence that follows long winters and dying cattle. But what he found instead was a house that sounded alive. Wood creaking as if exhaling. Curtains rippling through the windows were shut tight. Inside, 5 members of the Whitlow family sat upright around a table, faces tilted to the ceiling, eyes wide open, mouths frozen mid-scream. No water, no blood, just pale bloated faces, as if they'd swallowed the air itself and drowned in it. The sheriff said the air felt thick in there, like breathing through wet wool. His lantern flickered, though there was no wind, and every time he stepped closer, the floor groaned like something shifting beneath. Outside, the sky looked wrong, clear but shimmering, as though a thin layer of water rippled across it. The horses refused to go near the barn. Even days later, when neighbors came to help bury the bodies, no one could explain the wetness that clung to their skin, or why they all felt like they were suffocating under a sky that had forgotten how to breathe. It was said that the Whitlows didn't drown in water. They drowned in something far older, something that still lingers in the air of Montana's high valleys, waiting for anyone foolish enough to take a deep breath. Would you dare to visit that land and inhale? In 1871, the harsh Montana wilderness was not an easy place to call home. The land stretched endlessly, frozen under biting winds, and layered with silence that could make even the bravest men uneasy. Among these vast plains stood a lonely homestead belonging to the Whitlow family, a father, mother, and their 3 children. They had arrived from Ohio 3 years earlier, chasing the dream of owning land, of breathing free under the wide American sky. But by the spring thaw of that year, the Whitlow dream ended in one of the strangest and most terrifying discoveries in Montana's early history. When the local sheriff and 2 ranch hands arrived to check on them after weeks of no sightings, they found all 5 members of the family dead, yet the scene defied everything they knew about death. There was no blood, no struggle, no signs of poison or violence. The bodies were seated upright in their usual places, 2 at the table, 1 by the stove, and the youngest still clutching a rag doll near the window. Their faces were pale and bloated, their mouths frozen open in silent screams, and their eyes glassy and bulging as though they had drowned. But there was no water anywhere in the house, no bucket overturned, no spilled basin. The floorboards were dry, and the air inside the cabin had a strange heaviness to it, as if it were full of something invisible yet suffocating. The sheriff's initial thought was gas poisoning, though no one had ever heard of such a thing in those days, not out in the wilds of Montana. But there was no smell, no discoloration of the wood, no soot or signs of fire. The food on the table was still fresh, the stew in the pot half-eaten, frozen in place from the cold. Even the animals outside, the horses, the hens, and the old sheepdog, were alive but restless, their eyes wide, refusing to go near the house. One of the ranch hands, a man named Coulter, swore that when he stepped through the doorway, he felt as if he had walked into a fog that wasn't there. His chest tightened, and for a moment he thought he couldn't breathe. The sheriff dismissed it as shock, but Coulter wouldn't stop shaking until he was outside again. The strangest detail of all was the absence of any struggle. If the family had truly suffocated, why had none of them tried to escape? Why were they found sitting so still, as if death had come all at once and caught them in mid-breath? The coroner from Helena later confirmed the impossible. Their lungs were filled with moisture, almost as if they had inhaled water vapor directly into their chests. Yet, there was no source of it. The stove had gone cold long before their deaths, and the nearby creek was frozen solid. It was as though the air itself had turned liquid for just a moment, long enough to drown them where they sat. News of the event spread quickly through the sparse settlements nearby, carried by frightened whispers. Some said it was the work of a curse. Others blamed foul spirits trapped in the fog that rolled through the valley. The truth was, no one could make sense of it. Families living within a day's ride packed their wagons and left without saying goodbye. The cabin was abandoned, left to rot among the whispering pines, but old trappers still claim that when the wind dies in that valley, you can hear faint gasps echoing from the empty house, as if the Whitlows are still trying to breathe. The people who lived near the Whitlow homestead often spoke about a strange fog that seemed to haunt the land around their property. Unlike the normal morning mist that rose from the nearby creek and drifted off with the sunrise, this fog would hang low and stubborn, refusing to move even when the wind picked up. It was dry to the touch, not damp like real mist, and it carried a faint shimmer as though light bent unnaturally within it. Locals began to call it the still fog, because it appeared even when the air was perfectly calm, and sometimes it hummed faintly like a distant breath heard through a wall. Before the Whitlow family's deaths, several ranchers passing through the area had noticed it hovering above the treetops or sitting thick over the ground, swirling lazily around the old fence posts without spreading out. It was the kind of fog that made horses uneasy and silenced birds. Men who rode through it swore the sound of their own breathing echoed back at them, as if the air itself were breathing in return. In the months leading up to the tragedy, there had been more sightings of that peculiar fog than ever before. Old settlers remembered that the Whitlows complained about their chimney smoking even when the fire was low, about the house feeling damp, even on dry days, and about the children waking in the night, coughing and crying that the room was full of clouds. Martha Whitlow, the mother, had once told a neighbor that sometimes she saw ripples in the air, like heat rising from a summer road, inside their home, even though it was winter. She had taken to keeping all the windows open, even during snowstorms, claiming it helped them breathe easier. The neighbors thought it was nonsense, until one of them, a trapper named Griggs, visited in February and saw it for himself. He described a faint, milky haze that hung just below the ceiling, moving slowly as though alive. When he reached out to touch it, it felt neither warm nor cold, but his fingertips came away moist. Within an hour of leaving, he felt lightheaded, his lungs burning as if he had swallowed air too thick to swallow properly. After the family's bodies were discovered, talk of the fog became legend. Some claimed it was a natural phenomenon caused by underground vents or mineral vapors, though no one could find proof. Others whispered of something older, something that had always belonged to the land long before the settlers arrived. The Crow tribes had once warned travelers not to camp near that valley, speaking of a living mist that descended at night, taking the form of breath and memory. They said it was the air mourning the dead. When settlers ignored those warnings and built their homes there, the stories faded into superstition until the Whitlows' deaths brought them roaring back. Those who dared to approach the property after the incident said the fog still appeared, thin, shimmering, and soundless. But they swore that if you stood very still, you could hear a faint whisper running through it. Not quite words, but something close, like the sigh of someone struggling to breathe. Livestock avoided it. Dogs whimpered and refused to cross it, and even in broad daylight, the air around it seemed heavier. The sheriff himself claimed that when he returned weeks later to burn the house down, the fog gathered above the roof in a twisting column, almost like smoke moving backward, curling down instead of up. When the fire caught and the cabin crackled into ash, that fog didn't disappear. It spread outward for a few seconds, swallowing the clearing in silence before it vanished completely. From that day on, the valley never saw fog again, not even in the coldest mornings, as if the air itself had taken something from that house and left forever changed. The only man who claimed to have seen the Whitlow family alive in their final days was a trapper named Elias Boone, who lived half a mile east of their cabin. Boone was a loner, a man who had spent more winters in the Montana wilderness than most men could endure. His word carried weight among the settlers, not because he was educated or God-fearing, but because he rarely spoke unless something truly rattled him. When the sheriff questioned him about what he'd seen, Boone's hands shook as he told the story. He said that 3 days before the Whitlows were found dead, he had been checking his traps near the ridge when he noticed something strange about the light over their house. It shimmered faintly, as if a sheet of glass or water hung invisible in the air. The sun's reflection bent oddly above the roof, warping like heat haze, and a faint humming sound drifted on the wind. Thinking it might be a fire or smoke, Boone walked closer, but the air grew colder instead of warmer. That was when he saw them. Through the small window of their cabin, the family could be seen moving in strange, stilted ways. He described how Mr. Whitlow stood by the table, clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on dry land. The mother staggered toward him, hands outstretched, her face twisted in panic. The children were crying, but no sound carried through the window. Boone swore he could see their lips moving, could see the terror in their eyes, yet not a single breath of noise reached him. The most unsettling part was the way the air inside the cabin seemed alive, shimmering, pulsing faintly, rippling in waves around their bodies. Boone said it looked like they were underwater, though the room itself was perfectly dry. He called out, but his voice died in his throat, muffled as if he had yelled into a thick blanket. Even the echo of his own shout seemed swallowed. Panic clawed at him, and he took a step back, suddenly aware that the world around him felt wrong. The wind was still, the birds had gone silent, and the usual creak of the pines was gone. It was as though the air itself had stopped moving, waiting. Boone fired his rifle once into the air to try and draw them out, but the shot came out hollow, quieter than it should have been, like the sound had been stolen before it reached his ears. The family didn't react. They just kept gasping, reaching upward, eyes bulging, mouths open in perfect, silent screams. He swore the shimmer grew denser, spreading outward from the cabin like invisible smoke, and when it touched the treetops, they began to drip moisture, though no rain had fallen. Boone turned and ran, stumbling down the slope, his lungs burning as if the air had turned too thick to breathe. By the time he reached his cabin, his head was spinning and blood trickled from his nose. He stayed there for 2 days, too terrified to return. When the sheriff found the bodies later that week, Boone refused to step foot near the property again. He told anyone who would listen that the Whitlows hadn't died from anything natural. He said something had taken the air from them, something that made the wind itself stop, that pulled the breath right out of their lungs. His story spread through the settlements like wildfire, but most dismissed it as madness brought on by isolation. Still, there were a few who believed him, because they had felt it too, how the air near that ridge seemed heavy, how it pressed against your chest until breathing felt like a sin. Boone left Montana the following winter, saying the valley didn't want men in it anymore. Before he went, he told the sheriff one last thing, a whisper the man never forgot. "They didn't drown in water, Sheriff. They drowned in something you can't see, and it's still here, waiting for someone else to breathe." Among the few personal effects left behind at the Whitlow homestead, one item stood out with an eerie clarity, a small folded piece of parchment found in the father's coat pocket. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smudged from repeated attempts to press too hard, and the words seemed to tremble with the same fear that had overtaken the family in their final days. It was addressed not to anyone in particular, more a record of what Mr. Whitlow had witnessed in the days before the deaths. The first lines described an unusual phenomenon in the sky above their land, a series of what he called bubbles, translucent spheres that drifted just above the treetops, catching the sunlight and bending it in strange patterns. They moved slowly, yet deliberately, sometimes merging, sometimes splitting, like breath frozen in midair. Whitlow wrote that at first he thought they were some optical illusion, a trick of sunlight on ice or morning mist, but the more he watched, the more impossible they became. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat, and occasionally he could swear they whispered, a faint sighing that sounded like voices trapped just beyond comprehension. The letter continued with accounts of how the family began to change in response. The children complained of chest tightness, a feeling as though invisible hands pressed against them while they slept. Martha Whitlow described an oppressive heaviness that seemed to follow her through every room, especially when the bubbles appeared in the sky outside their windows. Whitlow himself wrote of nights spent standing on the porch, staring into the dark valley beyond, feeling as if the air was thickening, becoming almost viscous, filling his lungs with a weight that made each breath laborious. He mentioned that he tried to warn his neighbors, but the closest cabin was miles away, and in the darkness of those long Montana nights, even the smallest voice was easily swallowed by the wind. The most chilling parts of the letter were the descriptions of the family-on's attempts to interact with the bubbles. Whitlow wrote that he and Martha had tried to reach for them through the windows, waving their hands, thinking perhaps they could shatter them or make them vanish. But the air would ripple at their touch, and the bubbles would simply drift away, moving with a life of their own, sometimes hovering just above the children's heads in the nursery. They seemed to respond to fear, expanding and contracting as if sensing the family's panic. Whitlow admitted in the letter that he had begun to fear for their very lives. He described dreams in which he inhaled the bubbles, felt his chest swell until he could not breathe, and woke with sweat dripping from his face, clutching at invisible weight that lingered in the room. As the letter went on, the descriptions became more desperate. Whitlow claimed that the bubbles were not simply a visual phenomenon, but carried with them a tangible pressure, one that forced lungs to fill beyond capacity and made ordinary air feel thin and poisonous. He wrote that by the day before their deaths, the family's gasps and coughs had become constant. Even in rooms free of smoke or steam, he could see them trying to breathe, mouths moving, eyes wide, chest heaving against an invisible resistance. He confessed that he did not know if the bubbles were natural or some sort of curse, but he was certain that they were connected to the strange wetness he found on the floorboards, the faint glistening on the walls that could not be explained by snow or condensation. The letter ended abruptly. The final lines were frantic, jagged, and almost illegible. They rise from the clouds, they watch, and when you breathe too deep, they take it from you. I can hear them whispering my name now. I do not know how long before it is too late. When the sheriff read it, he said the words seemed to echo in the cabin itself, like the walls had absorbed them, carrying the panic forward. That letter, more than any other evidence, captured the terror of the Whitlows' final days, and it became clear that their deaths were not the result of disease, starvation, or frost. They had faced something that breathed through the air itself, a force so alien and precise that it left no trace but emptiness in their lungs and fear etched into the paper that survived them. When the coroner finally arrived at the Whitlow homestead to examine the bodies, he encountered a scene that defied every principle of anatomy and reason he had ever known. The family had been discovered days before, yet their forms seemed untouched by decomposition beyond the paleness of death. The father, mother, and 3 children were positioned as they had been found, upright in chairs or by the table, mouths frozen open, eyes wide. What drew the coroner's attention most was their lungs. Despite the absence of any nearby water, the autopsy revealed that each member of the family had lungs saturated with moisture, as though they had inhaled gallons of liquid directly into their bodies in the moments before death. The paradox was impossible. There was no flood, no rain, no leaky roof, and the floorboards beneath them were bone dry, not a single drop of water staining the wood. The air in the house, though heavy and thick with a faintly sweet odor, had left no condensation on the windows or walls. Whatever had filled their lungs had evaporated into nothingness, leaving the family dead yet surrounded by the illusion of drowning. The coroner, a seasoned man named Henry Toller, could not reconcile what he saw. He had performed countless autopsies, witnessed suffocation, drowning, and poisoning, but nothing matched this. The internal organs bore no signs of trauma, disease, or chemical reaction. There were no bruises, no cuts, no evidence of struggle. The lungs were waterlogged, spongy to the touch, almost gelatinous, yet there had been no external source to account for the moisture. Toller recorded every detail with meticulous care, noting the unnatural pallor of the skin, the rigidity in the family's limbs, and the way their faces were twisted in expressions of panic that seemed frozen in mid-scream. His assistants whispered among themselves, unsettled by the silence of the house, by the strange sensation of the air clinging to their lungs as they worked. Even they reported feeling faint, as though the weight of the room pressed upon their chests. Days later, when the bodies were buried in the frozen ground nearby, witnesses described the soil absorbing the bodies as if the earth itself refused to acknowledge what had happened. Neighbors who attended the small, hastily arranged service reported that the grave seemed unusually damp, yet there had been no rain, no melting snow, no trickling water to account for the condition. The coroner returned to Helena to write his report, and in his final notes he hesitated over how to categorize the deaths. "'Cause unknown," he wrote repeatedly. But beneath the words, he admitted in private correspondence to a colleague that he suspected some unknown force had acted upon the family, something that could manipulate air, something that could suffocate without leaving a trace. Within weeks, Toller himself disappeared. His cabin, left in haste, was discovered months later with the door ajar, papers scattered across the floor, but no footprints in the surrounding snow. Some claimed he had fallen victim to the same unseen force, while others suggested that the experience had driven him mad. Stories spread of the coroner's last letters describing a sensation in the lungs, a pressure that could not be expelled, the feeling of inhaling something alive and invisible. Scholars and doctors later debated the plausibility of such an occurrence, but no one could explain the discrepancy. Lungs full of moisture, yet a completely dry environment, bodies frozen in terror, and no earthly cause to account for the event. The phenomenon became a chilling legend in the area. Hunters and settlers reported feeling pressure in their chests when passing near the homestead, the air itself heavy, almost wet, even though the land remained dry. Livestock shied away from the house long abandoned, and the few who dared enter claimed the smell of dampness lingered, though the building had been empty for decades. It was as if the family had drowned, not in water, but in air itself, inhaling something that no one else could see, and leaving behind a mystery that would haunt Montana for generations. The coroner's report, his disappearance, and the evidence of waterlogged lungs in a bone-dry house cemented the story as one of the most baffling and horrifying events in the history of the American frontier. A terror that spoke of forces beyond human comprehension and the thin line between life, death, and the invisible dangers that can hide in the very air we breathe. The coroner who examined the Whitlow family, Henry Toller, was a man known for his diligence and methodical approach to death investigations. He had seen drownings, frostbite, epidemics, and violence, yet the Whitlow case had unsettled him in ways no previous assignment ever had. After completing the autopsies and documenting the impossible presence of moisture in the lungs of each family member, Toller returned to his modest cabin on the outskirts of Helena, intent on compiling his findings and submitting a formal report. Yet the days that followed marked the beginning of a chilling disappearance that would haunt the Montana Territory for years to come. Friends and colleagues noted that Toller began to grow increasingly withdrawn, refusing visitors and canceling planned appointments. Letters sent to the sheriff and other officials went unanswered, and the few neighbors brave enough to approach his cabin reported a strange stillness in the air around it. The wind seemed to hesitate as it passed, the usual creaking of the pine trees muted, and the dogs in the area refused to come near the property. By the first week of winter, months after the Whitlow family's deaths, Toller was gone. His cabin door stood wide open, papers scattered across the floor as if in a hurried departure. Snow had fallen heavily the night before, yet there were no footprints leading away from the cabin, no tracks that could indicate whether he had left on foot, by horse, or been taken by something far stranger. Local settlers speculated wildly. Some claimed that Toller had succumbed to a bout of cabin fever and wandered into the wilderness to die, but no remains were ever found. Others whispered darker theories, suggesting that whatever had claimed the Whitlows had returned for the man who had examined their bodies so thoroughly. They spoke in hushed tones of the pressure in the air near the cabin, a sensation that visitors felt pressing against their chests, much like those who had approached the Whitlow house. Even the most skeptical hunters who passed the cabin reported a peculiar heaviness in their lungs, an almost tangible resistance when inhaling, as if the air itself had been thickened with something unseen. Rumors persisted that Toller had left behind notes attempting to explain his own sensations, some of which were later recovered by a passing trader. In these fragments, he described a recurring dream in which he inhaled a dense, invisible substance that filled his lungs and refused to be expelled. He wrote of a faint whispering in the empty air, a voice that seemed to imitate his own breathing. He feared that by examining the Whitlow's deaths so closely, he had drawn the same attention from the force that had claimed them. According to the notes, he felt it everywhere, in the corridors of his cabin, in the still mornings outside, and even in the shallow breaths he took while awake. Friends who read the notes claimed they could sense Toller's fear seeping from the pages, an invisible weight pressing down upon them as they read. For years after his disappearance, Toller's name became synonymous with the Whitlow case, a cautionary tale about the dangers of investigating forces beyond human understanding. People claimed to see him wandering the forest on cold nights, sometimes near the ridge where the Whitlow cabin once stood, his outline pale in the moonlight, chest heaving as if struggling to breathe. Settlers reported sudden chills, inexplicable moisture forming on the tips of their fingers, and an oppressive pressure on their lungs when passing near the old coroner's cabin. Some of the more superstitious believed that Toller had not simply vanished, but had been consumed by the same invisible phenomenon that had filled the Whitlow's lungs, that he had inhaled something so alien it had removed him from the mortal world entirely. Scholars and investigators later speculated that the coroner's disappearance might have been linked to psychological trauma or environmental conditions, yet even the most logical explanations could not account for the absence of tracks, the open cabin door, or the reports of strange pressure in the surrounding air. The story of Toller's vanishing became intertwined with the legend of the Whitlow family. His disappearance reinforced the terrifying possibility that the force responsible for their deaths was not confined to a single house, a single family, or even a single generation. It was something that lingered, waiting, and it seemed to take those who sought to uncover its secrets. The coroner's fate served as a warning. The truth behind the Whitlow tragedy was not merely about the visible, the measurable, or the understandable. It was about the unseen, the intangible, and the invisible danger that can exist in the very air we breathe. A presence that could strike without warning, leaving silence, disappearance, and fear in its wake. Decades after the tragic deaths of the Whitlow family, the valley where their homestead once stood remained largely abandoned, a stretch of Montana wilderness that few dared to enter. Locals avoided the area, whispering that the land itself had been cursed, that something lingered in the air, invisible yet palpable, waiting to claim those who drew a careless breath. In the mid-20th century, aerial surveys of Montana began to map remote areas for development, wildlife studies, and forestry purposes. Surveyors flying above the old Whitlow property began to notice anomalies that seemed to defy explanation. The patch of land where the cabin once stood appeared oddly sterile compared to surrounding forests and meadows. Birds, which normally followed the thermals and breezes along the ridges, avoided this area entirely. Hawks and crows circled the valley but never touched the air directly above the old homestead. Even insects, mosquitoes, and flies, which normally thrived in the forests and marshes of Montana, were curiously absent. The land was alive in texture and color but strangely empty of movement. Meteorologists who studied the area were baffled. Weather patterns that passed over Montana seemed to skip this particular ridge. Rain clouds often broke up or diverted themselves around it, even during heavy spring storms. Snowfall would settle unevenly, lighter on the ground where the homestead had been and heavier around the perimeter. It was as if the air itself had been altered, subtly rejecting natural cycles that affected the surrounding terrain. Scientists could not explain why no storms, no gusts of wind, and no clouds would traverse that exact patch of land, yet local folklore had long insisted the place was unnatural. The surveys and photographs, originally intended for mapping purposes, captured faint distortions in light, a wavering shimmer across the valley, something barely perceptible yet persistent. Pilots reported occasional turbulence over the ridge, a sensation as if the air was denser or moving differently, even when atmospheric conditions were otherwise calm. Hikers and hunters who ventured into the valley in more recent years recounted experiences that echoed the stories of the Whitlow family's neighbors and of Elias Boone, the trapper who had seen them in their last days. Travelers described a weight pressing on their chests, a sensation of suffocation that came without warning. There was no water, no smoke, and no dense vegetation that could explain the feeling. Some claimed to see faint ripples in the air, shimmering distortions similar to the mirages that Whitlow had written about in his letter. Even the bravest hikers found themselves disoriented, losing track of direction and time while traversing what should have been familiar terrain. Dogs and other animals accompanying them often refused to cross the ridge, barking or retreating in fear, sensing something invisible and unnatural that humans could only vaguely feel. Local historians tried to reconcile these observations with the documented deaths of the Whitlows, connecting them to the strange air phenomena described in coroner Henry Toller's report and in the Father E.S. frantic letter. There was a growing sense that the valley's emptiness, its lack of birds, insects, and storms, was not a coincidence. Rather, it seemed to be a lingering effect of whatever had caused the Whitlow family's deaths, a remnant of an invisible presence that could alter the natural order of the environment. Even decades later, after human settlement had attempted to reclaim the area, nothing had thrived there as it did elsewhere. Crops failed, trees grew twisted and stunted, and wildlife skirted the area entirely, as though instinctively aware of the danger that still lingered. The valley's reputation spread quietly, drawing curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators who hoped to document or explain the phenomenon. Some claimed to experience chest tightness, the feeling of being unable to inhale fully, while others reported seeing ghostly silhouettes moving within the shimmer of the air. Photographs occasionally captured faint distortions, almost like ripples frozen in time, but no tangible evidence ever emerged. Scientists attempted to measure air density, humidity, and magnetic anomalies, but instruments registered nothing unusual. The effect appeared selective, perceptible only to living creatures sensitive to breath and movement. Even as the years turned to decades, the valley retained its chilling aura, a reminder that the Whitlows' deaths were not merely a tragic accident, but a sign of something far older and more powerful. The absence of birds, insects, and storms was more than a quirk of nature. It was proof that a force, whatever it was, had taken hold of the land, shaping the very air itself. And those who dared to stand on the ridge often reported the same feeling. An invisible pressure on their lungs, a quiet insistence that the air around them belonged to something unseen, waiting for the next soul to inhale its silent, suffocating presence. Even in recent years, long after the Whitlow homestead had crumbled into ruins and the valley had grown over with scrub and twisted pines, hikers and adventurers began reporting experiences that mirrored the terror of those who had lived and died there over a century earlier. People traveling through the area described sudden, inexplicable sensations pressing down on their chests, a tightening in the lungs that left them gasping despite the clear, open air around them. Some swore that the sensation began as a subtle heaviness, almost unnoticeable at first, and then intensified in waves, like invisible hands constricting their rib cages. Those who paused, desperate to catch their breath, often noticed faint distortions in the atmosphere, shimmering ripples that resembled the mirages seen by the Whitlow children through their frosted windows, or the bubbles described in Mr. Whitlow's frantic letter. Even when standing perfectly still in the middle of a sunlit clearing, the sensation persisted, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible whispering that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. Many hikers reported that their dogs or horses would refuse to enter certain parts of the valley, shying away from invisible boundaries that humans could not perceive. Birds avoided the area entirely, their absence creating a silence that felt unnatural, oppressive, and strangely heavy. People who tried to take photographs or record video often found the air above the old homestead shimmering faintly in the frames, distorted and wavering as if caught between two realities. Some even described feeling droplets of moisture on their skin, though the weather was dry and no water source was nearby. Those who stayed longer in the valley sometimes experienced dizziness, nausea, or a profound sense of unease, as if the very air had a will of its own, bending, pressing, and manipulating the body's most essential functions. Paranormal enthusiasts and investigators have flocked to the site over the years, drawn by the legend of the Whitlows and the inexplicable deaths that made the property infamous. Their reports often contain eerily similar details: an invisible weight pressing against the lungs, the whisper of voices just beyond comprehension, the faint shimmer in the air that seems to pulse in rhythm with the heartbeat. Many claim that the sensation is selective. Some feel it immediately upon entering the valley, while others experience it only after a prolonged stay. Attempts to measure humidity, air pressure, or magnetic anomalies have yielded nothing conclusive, reinforcing the belief that the phenomenon exists outside the boundaries of known science. Locals continue to treat the area with caution, sharing stories of hikers who never return, or who leave terrified and silent, refusing to speak of what they experienced. Those who are brave enough to describe it often mention that it is unlike any wind, fog, or storm. There is no moisture, no visible danger, no sharp edges. The danger is in the invisible, the very air itself, waiting, pressing, suffocating in ways that cannot be seen or touched. It is a reminder that the Whitlows' deaths were not a singular event, but the beginning of a legacy, a force tied to that land that endures and continues to affect anyone who ventures too close, anyone who dares to breathe freely without understanding that the air itself can be deadly. In a way, the valley acts as a living memorial to the Whitlow family, a place where the memory of their terrifying final moments is embedded in the very atmosphere, lingering like a whisper through the trees, a pressure in the chest, a warning to all who step into its borders. It is a testament to the invisible dangers that can hide in even the clearest sky, the quiet terror that can exist where nothing seems wrong, and the understanding that some forces are beyond comprehension. The stories of modern visitors confirm that whatever claimed the Whitlows is not gone, and that anyone who enters the valley risks the same suffocating embrace of the air itself, a deadly presence that has no need for water, no need for hands, and no need for sound to claim its victims. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.